speech. And what comes out of that is that his main concern, and it must be said, the main concern of his Sunni Arab allies in the Gulf and also of Israel, is Iran's behavior in the region. So he set out, first of all, this new strategy to counter what he said were Iran's aggressive actions across the region. He dealt with that, and then he went to the nuclear deal, underlining that and that is the way they see it. The nuclear deal is the secondary threat, and obviously basically saying it had to be redone. It was one of the worst deals that he had ever seen. It was, I mean, people around the world will now be doing a fact check on this. It was a very selective history. And the fact of the matter, it is history. Yes, after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, there was the seizing of the American hostages, hundreds of them. That is seared in American memory. Yes, death to America, death to Israel were the rallying cries. But this is Iran of 2017, with a reformist president who doesn't abide by the same slogans, who doesn't have the same approach to relations with the West. But yes, Iran does fund proxies, does organize proxies, Shia militias in Iraq and in Syria, but then so do the allies of the United States, so do Saudi Arabia, so do Qatar. They are backing some of the Islamist hardliners who have led to the creation of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and in Syria. So it's a very selective history. It's a history which has, his telling of history which leads him to the conclusion that Iran is the most important threat facing the United States and its allies, and that at last, under him, these actions will be taken. But there will be many who will say, yes, there are actions of Iran that need to be discussed by the United States and his allies, but the actions which he is taking today may lead to the opposite of what he hopes for, the peace and stability in the region. This will instead be deeply destabilizing.
Amir?
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, I see with the so-called Islamic State now, the threat of Islamic State now slowly fading away. I saw this portrayal of a new enemy. Not that the US and Iran were not at odds, they have been, but with that long list and the way President Trump structured it, now he's announcing Iran the prime enemy of the United States. But as Liz said, there is another big list on the other side of grievances from Iranian side, which starts in 1953 coup, which was engineered and executed by US and British Secret Services, and comes all the way through to 1980s when Iran-Iraq war happened. The support of West for Saddam Hussein, who was only recognized as an aggressor when he also invaded Kuwait, and then shooting down of Iranian airliner. The list goes on and on. There is a counter list on the other side as well. But in terms of substantially what he actually said, he does not certify Iran's compliance with the nuclear deal, and he will not. And he said that this will be reviewed in Congress. So basically hitting the can down the road to Congress. So this is where I stand. I said America first. I said I will guard your security and your interests. Now it will be the Congress that will have to decide exactly what that means and what they're going to do. But it is not walking out of the deal yet. But it does escalate the hostilities to a degree that it may one day steer one side or the other to walking out of the deal, or the hostilities will reach to a point where the deal, like you said, the spirit or the letter of the deal will not be complied with any longer.
And Liz, I mean, how much pressure is there on any party not to look like the one who is actually walking out on this deal?
Well, President Trump must have been told privately by he kept referring to his allies, his European allies. There's also the Russians and the Chinese who negotiated this deal. All of them said, don't walk away from the deal. All of them said the deal is working. So for him to say, I've been consulting my allies, maybe the allies in the region, as I mentioned, they want this deal to work, because even it's not a perfect deal. Negotiators don't come up with perfect deals. It was a give and take, that this is the best there is. And yes, let us work on the other things, but this is the best there is. As Amir says, he's not walking out yet. He held open the possibility that they could make this deal work. But what what a series of hurdles that this deal, the Iranians most of all, have to go through. First of all, he wants to reopen the deal. He wants ballistic missiles to be part of it. As I mentioned before, that's not part of the intention. He wants to have tougher inspections. I remember, you remember, Amir Parvar, during the negotiations when it was mentioned about the inspections by the IAEA, that they would visit nuclear sites, but Javad Zarif, the main negotiator, said you will not visit military sites. What country in the world allows outsiders to come to military sites? So it was agreed by all of the world powers it would not include military sites. President Trump is now saying the military sites have to be included. He mentioned the cases of where Iran didn't comply, but those were raised by the IAEA and Iran corrected them. There is a mechanism in place already for inspections. I think the IAEA would say they're as tough as they can get. And these other sanctions, I mean, you mentioned that, I mean, he fell short of designating the IRGC, the main security body, as a terrorist organization. So he's pulled back a bit, but he talked about these sanctions. There are already sanctions on the Al-Quds Force, for example, which is part of that. We have to wait and see what kind of sanctions are going to be imposed. Iran, I can just imagine, Amir is smiling, Iran makes a lot of the fact. In fact, it's one of the sort of defining national interests. They survived years of sanctions, and it wasn't lost on many that their rising influence in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Syria happened under sanctions. So sanctions or not, Iran will carry out its strategic objective. It's never been afraid of sanctions, but it is a country where people expected benefits from the nuclear deal. And if this is going to put a halt to new investments in Iran, it's going to have an effect both on Iranian politics, I think, with the hardliners, who always said, including Iran's supreme leader, said, go ahead and negotiate, but we don't trust the Americans. You cannot trust the Americans. There must be a lot of people in Tehran tonight saying, I told you so.
Let's bring in Barbara Plett-Usher, who's in Washington watching things there. And Barbara, how did what we heard from Donald Trump compare to what we'd been expecting?
I think pretty much as advertised, you know, a long description of Iran's allegedly bad behavior. He sees it as a terrorist nation, as he calls it. Then a long description of how he feels the nuclear deal doesn't meet requirements, that it was a weak deal that doesn't actually ultimately prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapons capability. And then the prescriptions that he put forward, had also been flagged up by senior officials that he will not certify the agreement. That is, he said, it is not, what Iran is being asked to do is not proportionate to the amount of benefit we're giving it from sanctions relief. So actually it doesn't meet U.S. conditions, U.S. legal conditions. And he's punting it to Congress as we expected, asking them to take sort of separate legal measures to tighten restrictions. And these will involve, he said, ballistic missiles. It will involve, especially he has a problem with the sunset clauses in the deal, as do many, but he feels that these need to be removed. He said that we want in legislation the fact that we don't accept that the limits on Iran's nuclear activity should ever expire. And then, of course, the sanctions that he talked about on the Revolutionary Guards and with regard to ballistic missiles as well. All of these things we had been flagged up. I mean, the question now is whether Congress can actually come up with the legislation that would carry out this, agree amongst itself, and then once it's done that, whether it can get allies on board to try to negotiate some tougher measures that might satisfy the Americans, but almost certainly, as Lise was saying, will not have Iran on board. So you're not going to have the deal scuppered tomorrow, as we know, but it's now gone into this stage where it's going to become quite a sort of political football, and you know, this fear that it could unravel over time.
Barbara, thank you there in Washington. Amir, I mean, in terms of any renegotiation, Tehran's stance would be simply no.
Exactly. Because, I mean, Lise remembers, this was 2 years of intensive negotiations, day in, day out.
Shouting, arguing, walking out.
All kinds of...
All the world powers, all the foreign ministers sitting around for weeks.
That deal has been negotiated up to the comas, up to every single word in that deal has been negotiated. You open that box, you open that Pandora box, it will be open to all sorts of renegotiations. Iranians are also not happy with how it delivers on the economic front, how still it keeps banks scared from dealing with Iran. So it is a big no from Tehran's perspective. Yes, if they come up with another platform whereby they can discuss regional security, plus missile program, all those concerns parallel to this existing deal, Iran might be interested. Depends what the other side is prepared to give and what Iran's demands will be in that front.
Please.
This was very interesting because at the United Nations it was the first meeting of the. It was interesting hearing President Trump say the JCPOA, that sort of difficult acronym, and they all sat down together. It was the first meeting where Tillerson, the Secretary of State, the U.S. Secretary of State, and Javad Zarif were in the same room, and the account of it afterwards was that everyone in the room, except for Secretary of State Tillerson, backed the Iran deal. And then Secretary Tillerson later said, well, good to meet Javad Zarif. I know the Iranians are very educated and they're very something he said, sophisticated or refined. And Javad Zarif was also sophisticated and refined. But there was where he said, but there's a new administration and we need to have a new kind of a deal. There isn't the nuclear negotiations prove that when you sit down, opposite sides around the table, and you stick with it, there is the possibility of reaching a conclusion. And this is what happened. As Amir said, and Barbara Plett was there 2 weeks on end. Not a perfect deal, but Iran also has its criticisms, and Javad Zarif has said, okay, fine, you don't like things? We don't like them either. Send back the 10 tons of nuclear fuel that we shipped out of the country under great opposition inside the country. If you open up the Pandora's box, the Iranians will open up the box, but I think President Rouhani was absolutely categorical in New York last month. There is no reopening of the deal, there is no return to the deal, there is no renegotiations. The deal is meant to move us forward and not move us back. Certainly there are a lot of things to discuss about Iran's actions across the region, but the big question now that's hanging over all of this is this one going to lead to more war, or is it going to lead to a greater and more secure region?
And Barbara, in Washington, in terms of where this goes from here, the ball is in Congress's court.
Yeah, and just to respond to what Lise was saying there, when Secretary Tillerson was speaking last night, he said they didn't expect to be able to open the deal. They'd like to renegotiate it, they'd like to reopen it, but they've been given a pretty clear message, as you've been hearing as well, that just isn't going to happen. So he's talking about trying to negotiate a follow-up agreement, specifically regarding the issue of the ballistic missile weapons program, trying to limit that, put curbs on that, but then also to get rid of the sunset clauses, which is something they keep talking about, that they want to make the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program extend indefinitely. And now it's not completely, it's not so strange to try to negotiate a follow-up agreement when you have an arms control accord. That's not necessarily an unexpected thing. But first of all, to start out by saying we're going to put in our own law that you can't, that those limits have to be on you perpetually. That's your starting point. And then to raise the confrontation level, the combative spirit in the way that President Trump has done with his speech and his measures suggests that even a follow-up accord would be quite difficult to deal with.
Barbara, thank you very much. Barbara Plett there in Washington. Amir Paiva here from BBC Persian, and Lise Doucette, our chief international correspondent. Thank you to all of you. You've been watching special coverage of President Trump's speech as he says and tells the public he has decided to decertify the Iran nuclear deal of 2015.
Hello there. Across Western Europe, all